Disclaimer: this episode may include graphic descriptions of crime and criminal activity. It may not be suitable for listeners who are under the age of 18 and people who may find the descriptions as disturbing. Listeners' discretion is advised from this point forward. Hello and welcome to this episode of Crime KE Podcasts. My good name is Ajuma. I am a journalist from Kenya and your host for this true crime podcast. And I'm so excited that you found time to listen in today. Thank you for listening to season 2 of Crime KE Podcast. This is the second episode of season 2 where I'll be telling you stories of some of Kenya's most wanted criminals in history. Now, in today's episode, I'll be unpacking the story of Kenya's self-confessed serial killer, Philip Onyancha. Now, if you're a Kenyan, you've probably heard about Onyancha and his activities from around 2007 to 2010. Onyancha has been named the Kenyan Vampire because several reports say that he drank the blood of his victims after killing them. This story is officially the craziest story I have ever researched on. I had to pause, breathe in, breathe out, and even go out and reconnect with nature after finding out some of the things I found in the research of this episode and next episode, of course, because this is part 1 of his story. I could not comprehend how one person can carry so much evil within them. Like, you should know that this is about to be a very crazy episode, 2 episodes. Now, without further ado, let us get into today's episode. Also, please stick around until the end of this episode to find out how you can support this podcast. Philip Onyancha was born in Kericho in 1978. He grew up in the family's tea farm, and in every sense, he seemed to have grown up living a comfortable life. He had brothers and sisters, and his family was pretty normal. His mother said that out of all her kids, she had considered Onyancha to be the brightest. She invested in him the most because she knew that he was bound to have a bright future, and he would even be the one to help his siblings. Onyancha grew up a quiet kid and he was very soft-spoken. He was academically bright and performed above average in school. Now, the one thing that Onyancha says he struggled with growing up was his sexuality. According to Onyancha, in his early childhood years, he was sexually assaulted by his nanny, and this gave him the notion that if he wanted something, he could just take it, even using force. Listen to Onyancha explain how that experience changed his mindset.
I couldn't face it, and I was a shy guy. I never was brave to face up a girl, but due to the crooked perception that I got from the sexual abuse, I was like, now, when you want something, you don't have to follow the channel that is needed. You just go shortcut it and you get it. Use force, use whatever. That's the picture I got.
At this time, he also began watching a lot of pornographic content, which did not necessarily help the situation. He was questioning a lot of things about his sexuality and his sexual interest, but nobody really knew that he had any issue because on the outside, he looked and even behaved like a normal kid. He was performing very well in school and people around him assumed that everything was okay with him. They did not know that he had some things bothering him on the inside. Now, he completed his primary school education and he was called to join Kenyatta High School, Mahiga. He joined the school as a Form 1 student and immediately he became a favorite even among his teachers. In Form 1, he performed very well in class. He performed well even outside class in sports and even social activity. Everyone knew that he was destined for success, so Form 1 was a great year for Onyancha. Now, when he got to Form 2, he changed. And in some interviews, even his teachers acknowledged that there was something different about this student who seemed to be a star in the beginning. His teachers say that he went from being a social person to being very distracted and even slacking in class. At some point in Form 2, he was even suspended for bullying another student. Now, in Form 3, things did not get any better. He was caught up in sexual assault allegations in school where he was accused of sodomizing another student. So he had a lot of cases here and there in school, well, from Form 2 till Form 4. Well, despite these cases in school, he finished high school and left. Now, even though he left school, the same behavior seemed to follow him outside school. Now, after high school, an incident happened at home, and some sources I found for this episode say that he defiled a minor, and another source say that a neighbor accused him of trying to steal from them. So I am not quite sure what happened, but whatever happened caused him to move away from home. At this time, he said that the reason why he decided to move away was because he was hearing voices in his head, and he thought that moving away from home would help him clear his head. So he moved to Nairobi from home and joined the workforce immediately after high school. He got a job working as a security guard for G4S, and this job required him to move around a lot, if you know how G4S works. Now, in the mid-2000s, Onyancha met a lady identified as Lydia. They decided to move in together and get married. So they got an apartment and settled in. In 2008, the couple got their firstborn son. And soon after this, Lydia began to notice that her husband had weird behaviors. Onyancha began staying out very late at night, and sometimes she said that he would completely not return at home till the next day. Now, when Lydia confronts him and asks him why he is staying out late, Onyancha reassures her because she actually said that she thought he had another family outside. Now, he denied the allegations, but he doesn't really explain to her what he's doing when he's out late at night or when he does not come home throughout the whole night. And at this time, Onyancha also starts having very unnecessary disagreements with their neighbors. The sources I used for this episode reported that they would argue over the normal stuff that neighbors argue about, but Onyancha would take it to another level. Like, he would play very loud music at night, causing disturbance to the sleeping neighbors. And he knew that the neighbors would not report him because they were also afraid of him. Now, one time, a neighbor reported him to the authorities for an incident, and Onyancha actually came and told the neighbor that he would hire somebody to kill them for reporting them. At this time, I should mention that Onyancha had some sort of tumor that had started growing at the back of his head. Some people thought that it was the reason for his erratic behavior. People feared him because one small thing would result in, I don't want to say a crash out, but he would just blow things out of proportion. Now, in July of 2009, a young boy identified as Samuel Wanyonyi disappeared. Samuel had just arrived in Nairobi for school and was living with his aunt. He had just been in Nairobi for 3 months when he disappeared. His family quickly realized that Samuel had been kidnapped when they found a note on his aunt's doorstep. The note was instructing Samuel's family to send 4,000 Kenyan shillings as ransom to his kidnappers. Samuel's family reported this to the police and hoped that they would be able to bring their child back home since they could not afford that 40,000 shillings at the time. Police and neighbors organized search parties to try and find Samuel, but they were unsuccessful. Onyancha was part of these people who would actually volunteer to go out and search for Samuel. When the family delayed sending the ransom money, Samuel's family started receiving threatening phone calls from the kidnappers. They would call the family telling them that if they don't send the money, they would kill their child, but the family could actually not afford this money, so the threats were really not helping the situation. Now, after several days, the family received a second letter from the kidnappers. They found a letter and the clothes that Samuel was wearing when he went missing at their doorstep. And at this time, the kidnapper told them that he would give them Samuel back for just 10,000 shillings if they could not afford the 40,000 shillings. Of course, they told the police about this letter again, and they still organized search parties because they could still not afford the 10,000 shillings as ransom. Now, one time, during one of the operations to find Samuel, Onyancha told Samuel's family that he was sure that the handwriting in those notes was from a woman. I don't know how he figured that out. Now, after several searches and police operations, Samuel's case goes cold and he remains missing. At this point, the family just assumes that he's dead and they go into mourning because they had been told that their child would be killed if they didn't send the money, and they hadn't sent the money and they could not afford the money. Now, I should mention that around 7 months before Samuel went missing in November of 2008, a 32-year-old mother identified as Catherine went missing, and her case had also gone unsolved for 7 months by the time Samuel was going missing. In January 2010, another young woman identified as Helen Nyambura was found dead in a motel room. And by the time she was found, it seemed that she had been dead in the room for several days. People are shocked that someone was in the room for that long without being discovered, and when the police are alerted to come and get her out of the room, there are big crowds outside. And guess what? Onyancha is part of this crowd of people watching as the police remove Helen's body from this motel. Now, Helen's cause of death was ruled to have been caused by an epileptic seizure, so there was not much of an investigation into her death. Now, at this time in the early 2010, Onyancha begins missing work a lot, and he even gets in trouble with his bosses because of this. At the same time, in Thika, there are increased cases of women who were sex workers. They were going missing and being found dead in motel rooms. Every other day in the news, there would be a sex worker found dead in a motel room with police having no evidence to go by in all the cases. In February 2010, another sex worker identified as Jacqueline Wamboi was found dead in a motel room after she met with a client the previous night. She was found naked in the hotel room with her neck broken and no evidence, like just the other cases. After several days of investigation, police were unable to solve Jacqueline's murder. Now, remember when all this was happening, Onyancha is getting into a lot of trouble at work for missing work. So in March, Jacqueline dies in February. In March, Onyancha gets fired from his job. Now, in April, a 9-year-old boy named Anthony Merui goes missing in Nairobi. And the thing is, just like Samuel's family, Anthony's family found a letter at their doorstep. In the letter, the family is directed to send money to a phone number that they are given, and they are told that if they send the money, they can get their child back. Now, Anthony's family was able to send the kidnapper the ransom, and once they did, they never heard from the kidnapper again about how they would find their son. Days and weeks passed without Anthony's family knowing where their son was, and at some point there was even a reward put out for 40,000 shillings for someone who would come forward with any information on how to bring back Anthony. 2 months after his disappearance, in the first week of June, Anthony's decomposing body was found in the Lenana area of Karen in Nairobi. The medical examiner said that Anthony was killed immediately after he went missing because of the rate of decomposition that his body had gone through. It did not seem like he had been killed close to the time he was found dead. It seemed like he had been dead for at least 2 months. On the 5th of June 2010, police discovered that Onyancha has been a constant in these cases that they are investigating. If he's not in the crowd of people watching as they take the bodies of dead people, then he's on the ground searching with the families of missing kids and even advising them about the handwriting in the ransom notes. Now, the phone data from the mobile phone used by the kidnappers was traced to Onyancha's circle of friends. They traced the money sent to the kidnappers and it led them right back to Onyancha. At this point, Onyancha confesses to murdering at least 18 victims. They arrest Onyancha, take him in for questioning, and this confession just breaks this case wide open. He confesses to murdering Anthony, Samuel, the missing mom, Catherine, Helen, and many other victims. He describes to the police in detail about how he lured his victims, murdered them, and disposed of their bodies. This story went viral after this confession, and I think this is the first time I heard the word serial killer. I remember being really young when hearing about Onyancha for the first time, and the thought of someone killing people and drinking their blood didn't sound quite right. Like, my brain at the time, in 2010, I was 9 years old. Like, my 9-year-old brain could not comprehend that someone could actually do that. And like most people, Lydia, who was Onyancha's wife, learned of his husband's activities through the news because she was actually at home when the police came and took her husband for questioning. And she said that she thought that this was just a questioning and he would be back home. Now, when Onyancha did not return home that night, she did not think it was a big deal because it was kind of normal for him to stay out. And the next morning, she was shocked to see her husband's face all over the news, saying that he had confessed to killing 18 people, mostly women and children. She was learning the news with everyone else, and when she saw this, she took their son and left their house and went back to her parents' home. She decided to flee because she knew people would come and try to retaliate because what her husband had done caused a lot of outrage between his family and the community. And people had at some point even threatened to burn their house down. Now, that is part 1 on the story of Kenya's self-confessed serial killer, Philip Onyancha. Catch part 2 of this story next week, where I will go into details of Onyancha's confession, his trials, and I will also explain why he may actually go free after everything. You can support this podcast by sharing it with your friends so that we can reach a larger community of listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, share it on social media and tag us at crime.ke on Instagram. I love interacting with you guys on social, so if you have listened to it and you love it, you can share and tag me or the podcast. You can reach me on my social media through the handles that I've provided in the show notes of this episode. Follow the podcast on Instagram at crime.ke and interact with our posts. I also share updates on the cases that I talked about in season 1 on the podcast Instagram page. So if you're not following the podcast, then you're missing out on some of the details of these cases. If there is a specific episode or a story that you want to listen to in this season of the podcast, then you can always DM me or the podcast. If you want to share any feedback, you can send in your voice messages through the email that is in the show notes too. Then maybe I can play some of those messages after the episodes. Rate the podcast on the platform that you're listening in from, and don't forget to catch the next episode of Crime KE podcast on Thursday next week. Same time, same place. But until then, stay safe and remember, it's crime with a K.